In the previous episode, Jan Ruff described the darkest period of her life. The war eventually ended, but freedom did not mean that the suffering was over. For almost 50 years, Jan carried the memory of what had happened in silence. Then, late in life, something changed. She discovered that the very experience she had tried so hard to bury could give her a new purpose. This is the final part of Jan Ruff's story, The Strength to Survive.
After the war, as soon as we were able to, we left the camp and the family returned to Holland. After the war, my whole family was reunited. I think we were 1 in 1,000. We all survived. Most families lost someone, husbands, wives, babies. My father had survived the war too, in dreadful conditions, working on a little-known death railway in Sumatra. Something that happened after the war which affected me very deeply. Before the war, I had wanted to become a nun. When the war was over, that desire was still very strong, and I felt a desperate need to talk to a priest. It was very difficult to tell him what had happened to me. As I told him of the abuse and humiliation, I wept. I told him that I still wanted to become a nun and asked him for guidance. There was a long silence. Finally he said, "My dear child, under the circumstances and because of what has happened to you, I think it is better that you do not become a nun." I was crushed. What I needed was understanding and support. What I got was rejection. It gave me a terrible feeling of inferiority and confusion. Was I now soiled and somehow dirty and not good enough for the religious life? But I never felt bitter against the priest or against the Catholic Church. The Church is made of human beings, and human beings make mistakes. You have to see things in the context of the time. That was how people thought then. Tom and I got married and went to live in England for a while. I wanted to have children straight away. However, because of all the damage that my body had received from the brutal rapes, I had 4 miscarriages. After receiving major surgery, I had 2 daughters. Years of silence. There was an interesting contrast between the reaction of the priest and the reaction of my future husband, Tom. Tom had tears in his eyes when I told him what had happened. He accepted me. But surprisingly, we never spoke about it again. That was it. Tom couldn't handle it either. Nowadays, people can talk about that sort of thing more easily. It was different then. It was just something you couldn't talk about. If I could have talked about it with Tom, it would have been easier for me in my married life to carry this burden. Living with the secret of what had happened to me was an enormous burden. It is impossible to imagine what it takes to hold something like that down within yourself, something that you have to talk about, but you can't because of this terrible, terrible shame. All you can think is, nobody must know. You carry the burden all your life, afraid that at some time it is going to come out. For 50 years I carried this weight and wanted to scream it out, but I couldn't. I couldn't tell my family. I couldn't tell other women. When you have a horrific experience like this, it never really leaves you. The hurt is so deep it leaves a scar, which will always be there. It comes to the surface when something triggers it. For me, just the act of going to bed at night can bring back disturbing memories. Sometimes I can't sleep for a whole night because of these memories. But afterwards, you have to get on with your life. You have to make something out of your suffering. It's what you do with your suffering that counts afterwards. It's no use feeling sorry for yourself. It's what you do with it then. For 50 years, I never talked about it. But now, late in my life, when I'm old and when I'm really in the weakest time of my life, God is somehow using me again to spread some sort of a message. The message is perhaps one of faith and forgiveness. I have made something out of the suffering. It hasn't gone to waste. You can help other people with your experiences. And I think this is important. Faith. If you go through life and everything is easy, you don't need God. So you don't pray. I think suffering brings you closer to God because you feel how much you need Him. During the war, I was really stripped of everything. The Japanese had taken away my home, my possessions, my family, my youth, my dignity. But there was one thing they could not take away, and that was my faith. That's where I got my strength. Because when you have nothing left, there is only God. It is just you and God alone. Faith is a very important thing in a person's life. When things go wrong, when disasters happen, or when you lose someone close to you, it is your faith that brings you through. I was teaching in Catholic schools, which gave me the opportunity to teach the children to pray. The first thing in the morning after their news, I would say, "What shall we say thank you to God for this morning?" Is there anything that happened on the way to school that you can say thank you for? I remember one little child putting up her hand and saying, "Mrs. Ruff, Mummy let me have ponytails this morning." She wanted to say thank you to God for that. Isn't it a wonderful thing to be able to teach children to be thankful for the little things in life? I remember meeting an Italian boy named Pepe. I had taught him in year 1 and 2. I met him again when he was 18 years old. He said, "Mrs. Ruff," and I said, "Pepe." He threw his arms around me and said, "You know, I have never forgotten you because you taught me how to pray." To hear that from an 18-year-old boy, I thought that was wonderful. Breaking the silence. Then, in early 1992, the silence surrounding the Japanese system of military sex slavery began to be broken. The story of the Korean women started to receive media attention. Each time I saw them on television, I was moved to tears. How dare the Japanese call these poor abused women comfort women? We were never comfort women. We were war rape victims, enslaved by the Japanese Imperial Army. A group of Korean women took legal action demanding compensation from the Japanese government. I could see that if they got the support of European women who had suffered in the same way, then their case would be stronger. That was when I realized that I had to speak out. My chance came when I was asked if I would be willing to be a witness at an international public hearing in Tokyo. If I agreed, it meant that I had to tell my friends and my family before I went. I made the painful decision to go ahead. I wrote all my secret experiences down in a notebook. I wasn't ready to describe them face to face to my daughters, so I handed them the notebook. They both cried for weeks. They were absolutely horrified. It took them a long time to come to terms with what had happened to their mother. Return to Japan. When I told my daughters that I would be going to Japan to testify, they said, "You can't go alone. We're coming with you." We boarded the plane. I realized that I was now going to enter a Japanese environment, the language, the food, the customary bowing, and I began to feel uneasy. When I heard the first male Japanese voice on the plane, I started to shake. The closer we got to Japan, I could feel the fear building up. On the evening before the hearing, I met the brave Korean women who had broken the silence. Although we couldn't speak the same language, we hugged each other warmly. I also met many good Japanese people who gave us sympathy and support. The next day at the hearing, I gave my testimony. I declared that I had forgiven the Japanese for what they had done to me, but I could never forget it. Before going to Japan, I had decided that I wanted to lay a wreath for forgiveness at the Japanese memorial to the unknown soldier. My daughter and I made the wreath from Australian wildflowers. A group of former Japanese soldiers came to the memorial. They were now working for peace. I looked at them and thought, any one of these could have abused me, but they gave me flowers, they gave me gifts, and they said, I am sorry. That was when the healing really became complete. It is an amazing thing that this had to happen in Japan. A lot of people found it difficult to understand how I could forgive but not forget. I think you have to be able to forgive, no matter what happens to you, because you have to get on with your life. If you can't forgive, there is no healing. My hurt was deep, of course, but I was able to forgive because I can see that there is good in all people. I don't think the Japanese are bad people. It's the war that made them bad. It's the situations. Basically, all people are good. I feel very strongly that only in forgiveness can healing be found. The most wonderful thing about the trip to Japan was meeting the other women. The Korean women, the Chinese, the Taiwanese, the Filipina women. We put our arms around each other. Nobody in the world could understand our suffering other than us, the ones who had been through it. We understood each other's burden. We understood what it had been like to live with it for so long, to embrace those women. That was total healing. Speaking for others. I've had a lot of women come to me who have been abused. They come and talk, and they are able to draw some strength from the way I dealt with my own experiences. I've been asked to give talks to women's groups, church groups, the Red Cross, Rotary, military societies and schools. People nowadays are interested in knowing the truth about what happened during the war. We are the last generation, and if we don't tell our stories now, they will be lost. Just after the war, people didn't want to know. The attitude was, don't tell us your stories, the war is over, forget about it. But now, there is a generation that wants to hear these stories before we are all dead. I've spoken to students at Catholic colleges. I tell them quite openly about what happened. I base the story on teaching values, to respect their bodies, to have faith, to have strength. Even if it is 50 years on, it hasn't been wasted. We've got to tell these stories so that these things never happen again, so that history doesn't repeat itself. Redemption. Breaking the silence was essential. Breaking the silence and speaking the truth. If we cover up the truth, something goes bad inside and festers. If we speak up at the right time, the light enters and the healing begins. The burden I carried for 50 years was so terrific and so horrible that finally being able to speak was a wonderful feeling. It was my own dark secret, kept alive by my silence. I have been able to cleanse it by speaking the truth. When my book was written, I felt that late in my life, when I'm at my weakest, suddenly God had found a good purpose for me. He's using me somehow, in some way. I have a message to give to the world. This is quite a wonderful thing to have late in life. When other people think this is the end and they are going to retire, I feel that I am only just beginning. I feel I have a great task in front of me. I feel I have a real purpose in life.
Jan Ruff spent almost 50 years believing that the darkest part of her life had to remain hidden. When she finally spoke, she discovered that the truth did not destroy her. It released her. And by telling her story, she gave courage to others whose stories had remained untold. Jan's journey had taken her from the innocence of childhood, through darkness, and finally into the light. Loss, darkness, redemption.